All right, everyone. Technical gremlins be damned. We're going live. We're going on the air. Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 45 of This Week is Live. I'm your host, Raymond Flowchat from mxdwn.com. That's Mixdown. Thanks for joining us. So glad to see you well. There has been just nothing but technical problems today. Sometimes the internet gods don't cooperate and you don't have the bandwidth you need or the internet throughput that you need to do a show like this. And other times technology just fails. So we're going to make the best of it. And thankfully, we are on the air and things are happening as they should be. So we're going to do this and we're just going to try to plow right through because there's a lot of ground to cover. And I probably hinted at this in some of the social media promotions for today's show. Today's story is going to be a bit of a scorcher, and it's probably going to piss quite a few of you off. I apologize in advance if this rubs you the wrong way, but there's something I need to say, and not everyone's going to like to hear it. That's all I can say. And what is journalism if not speaking the truth, even at times when it's incredibly inconvenient? So let's get right into the headlines. There's a lot of ground to cover here, and first and foremost, in the realm of shitty bad news, Bandcamp, which has recently been acquired by a company called Songtradr. For those of you that don't know, it's a music licensing service. Bandcamp was sold by their original parent company, Epic Games, which had in turn laid off recently 16% of their own staff, being kind of a purveyor of a game distribution service and the maker of many very popular video games as it is. They were selling off Bandcamp and all of its assets to a company called Songtradr that does music licensing. Well, Songtradr has announced that they are efficiently and effectively laying off 50% of Bandcamp staff. Now, if you're not a giant music fan, Bandcamp is a really wonderful website, or at least it was, which was kind of like a combination between a digital storefront and kind of like a streaming activation service. It was a really great tool for independent musicians and bands or smaller bands that aren't giant, mainstream kind of confections to have a way to sell and market their products, give people a chance to experience them, even tip them if they don't want to necessarily outright buy something. And, Bandcamp was known for doing this thing called Bandcamp Fridays, which they would waive even their fees, which would help put more money in the artist's pocket, which is kind of always been a huge problem in the ways of music. Well, unfortunately, half of those people no longer have their jobs. And unfortunately, if you're not familiar with how things go with corporate restructuring and acquisitions and mergers, this is unfortunately, sadly, very common. When companies buy other companies, they usually are aiming at cutting costs. They're trying to make sure that there's a chance that they have a profit on their investment. How that slide ruler is being applied is rarely ever transparently conducted. And their own statements on this, coming from Songtradr, are incredibly cryptic. And what they had to say was, over the past few years, the operating costs of Bandcamp have significantly increased. It required some adjustments to ensure a sustainable and healthy company that can serve its community of artists and fans. After a comprehensive evaluation, including the importance of roles for smooth business operations, and pre-existing functions at Songtradr, 50% of Bandcamp employees have accepted offers to join Songtradr, which means 50% have not. They continued by indicating, "We are committed to keeping the existing Bandcamp services that fans and artists love, including its artist-first revenue share, Bandcamp Fridays, and Bandcamp Daily. We are looking forward to welcoming Bandcamp into our musically aligned community. We share a deep passion for all things music and will continue to serve artists, labels, and the fans who make it possible." So, sorry to all of you who were Bandcamp employees and made that service so useful. It's not a kind of thing a publication such as ours talked about very much. I mean, because, we're constantly trying to look at art and entertainment and in the world of music, the distribution mechanisms for them, unless there's big contractual news about it, we don't often talk about it, but Bandcamp really worked. It's kind of like RDO back in the day. No one ever talks about RDO, but RDO was a superior streaming service to Spotify and the other services that people like nowadays. And unfortunately, it went under. They were losing a lot of money and they no longer exist. They were sold off for parts. And, but it wasn't something you talk about because things that tend to work and are just there and useful, you don't sing a lot of praise for. So sorry to all of you at Bandcamp that have lost your jobs. Elsewhere in the bad news department, we've been talking to you a lot about the kind of what was dual strikes, now singular strikes, happening in the arenas of film and television. And this was first the WGA, the Writers Guild of America, against the AMPTP, the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers. This was what was known as the writer's strike. Well, that's been resolved, at least in principle, waiting a vote from the guild, the Writers Guild. And then these are all the people who write the shows and movies that everybody watches, the endless, voracious amount of content that we consume here in America and elsewhere and abroad. Well, and then in parallel, there was the SAG-AFTRA strike, which is the, excuse me, the Screen Actors Guild American Federation of Television and Radio Artists. So this is all of the talent. These are all the people that play the parts and then make all of these things go. That strike is ongoing. Now, we've been off the air here for 2 weeks, so that means that there's been more going on than usual, and we haven't had a chance to cover everything. We won't have a chance to cover everything because the pace of news happening is just insane. But unfortunately, the news that is that as of a week ago, no deal was reached. Everybody left the negotiating table. Ultimately, the situation has been fraught with tension for quite a while. And the situation has long been that the terms that they are debating over, most sticky and thorny of which being artificial intelligence. So I'm going to bring up their statement here because I want to make sure that I read it for you all. Has not been resolved. Now, apparently, the WGA and their negotiators were able to find terms that were amenable by what their union membership wanted. But in the arena of actors for film and television, things get thornier yet still because it's on one level their work product, right? Writers with the ability to write things in their tone of voice and things like that. But actors, the situation gets even thornier because there's their likeness, their presence, their cadence, their voice. And what is one of the big sticking points in this is that the networks, the production companies, the movie studios want to be able to have the ability to ingest that into artificial intelligence and then subsequently use it. And of course, the acting, union membership does not want that. They want their likeness and their ability to consent to their likeness being used to be of their own volition. So SAG-AFTRA had this to say as negotiations broke down a week ago, literally a week ago. To our fellow SAG-AFTRA members, it is with profound disappointment that we report the industry CEOs have walked away from the bargaining table after refusing to counter our latest offer. We have negotiated with them in good faith, despite the fact that last week they presented an offer that was, shockingly, worth less than what they proposed before the strike began. These companies refuse to protect performers from being replaced by AI. They refuse to increase your wages to keep up with inflation, and they refuse to share a tiny portion of the immense revenue your work generates for them. We have made big, meaningful counters on our end, including completely transforming our revenue share proposal, which would cost the companies less than 57 cents per subscriber each year. They have rejected our proposals and refused to counter. Instead, they use bully tactics. Just tonight, they intentionally misrepresented the press the cost of the above proposal, overstating it by 60%. They have done the same with AI, claiming to protect performer consent, but continuing to demand consent on the first day of employment for use of a performer's digital replica for an entire cinematic universe or any franchise project. The companies are using the same failed strategy they tried to inflict on the WGA, putting out misleading information in an attempt to fool our members into abandoning our solidarity and putting pressure on negotiators. But just like the writers, our members are smarter than that and will not be fooled. We feel the pain these companies have inflicted on our members, our strike captains, IATSE, Teamsters, and basic craft union members, and everyone in this industry. We have sacrificed too much to capitulate to their stonewalling and greed. We stand united and ready to negotiate today, tomorrow, and every day. Our resolve is unwavering. Join us on the picket lines and at solidarity events around the country and let your votes be heard. One day longer, one day stronger, as long as it takes. Firmly digging in their heels for the battle that has been and the battle to come. So right now, nothing's happening. Everybody's just back to protesting, staying at their own sides of the negotiating table, and no one's talking. So that means for all of you that are interested, movies, TV shows, what is there, what's coming out is it. After that, there's going to be an enormous dry spell, especially if you're like a regular TV watcher. There's going to be nothing but reality TV because if there's no actors that show up to film anything, nothing's getting filmed. So the well is going to run dry really soon. And not to mention that all of these people can't make a living. We're not talking about people like the old days of Hollywood where they had contracts for years and they'd be a part of making X number of pictures based on a studio contract. These people don't get hired. They don't get paid. They don't work. They don't get paid. So everything still totally in limbo as it's been. An interesting kind of side note, and I don't really know what to make of this, but I just found it too interesting to not bring up in regards to this. A group which includes it's various Hollywood A-listers: George Clooney, Scarlett Johansson, Tyler Perry, Emma Stone, and Ben Affleck. According to Variety, Variety has this reporting that they have basically made their own argument to the SAG-AFTRA leadership and negotiators in terms that they think how things could be accelerated. Now, if your actors or actresses on that level of the game, you're not really in need of the kinds of things that, like, they're getting paid tremendous amounts of money. They're famous A-list superstars. Their agents are getting them multi-million-dollar deals every time they step up to the plate. So, sure, this is hurting them too, but the kinds of things that SAG-AFTRA is fighting for, it's not really the A-listers that they're fighting for to get this. It's the below the line people, the average workaday people, the people who are everything other than the celebrities and the A-listers in terms of superstars. And according to Variety sources, they're saying that sources with knowledge of the situation say the group of some 15 stars, which includes Tyler Perry and Scarlett Johansson, had a follow-up call last night with SAG-AFTRA's negotiating committee. And what they're saying, this is their characterization, we do not have these sources. It didn't go well, says one of the sources, adding that the committee didn't see the validity of the group's proposal. Apparently, what they're proposing was which called for removing the cap on dues in a bid to bring more than $50 million in to the union annually and $150 million over 3 years. They suggested a bottom-up residual structure whereby top earners would be the last to collect residuals rather than the first. Doesn't make much sense to me either. I'm not entirely sure how that's helpful when they're trying to extract a more fair contract, at least the union and the union membership is, from the production companies. But interesting to note that they're trying to get things moving, because nobody in Hollywood can work right now when this is happening, and nothing is going to happen, and there's going to be a long jam, and how long before movie theaters start going bankrupt? There's just hordes of problems behind all of this. I thought it would be interesting, and it's kind of a little bit of a happier piece of news. There's always so much bad news going on out there, and I thought this would be something at least a little bit, happier in terms of relative terms. The great actor Michael Caine has announced that he is formally retiring at the ripe old age of 90 years old. Michael Caine is an amazing actor, and you've probably seen dozens of movies that have Michael Caine in it and did not realize that was Michael Caine. Many people, probably their closest, most obvious anchor is his role playing Alfred the Butler, Alfred Pennyworth, in Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight trilogy, which is Batman Begins, The Dark Knight Rises, and, but he's been in a million jillion things all throughout his career, not the least of which being the original Italian Job, Get Carter, the original Get Carter, I should point out, for those of you that are thinking of the Sylvester Stallone Get Carter, The Man Who Would Be King, A Bridge Too Far. He also won Oscars for his part in Woody Allen's comedy Hannah and Her Sisters, and then later on in The Cider House Rules in 1999 for Best Supporting Actor. He's also had parts in The Quiet American, Dressed to Kill, The Quills, one of my favorite movies of the last 25 years, Children of Men. Holy smokes, what a great movie. What a crazy, scary, intense movie. If you've never seen it, go watch it. And Michael Caine isn't a huge part of the movie, but still an incredible, brilliant masterpiece of a movie, but also comedic fare. He was in The Muppet Christmas Carol back in the early 90s. He played in Austin Powers in Goldmember. Yes, that's a real movie if you weren't familiar with the Austin Powers series of movies that Mike Myers used to do. Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, and then, of course, other Christopher Nolan brilliant adult dramatic fare, including The Prestige, another one of my favorite movies of the last 25 years, Inception, Interstellar, and Tenet. And ultimately, Michael Caine's movie that just came out called The Great Escaper, which just came out on October 6th, is going to be his last. He has indicated that he believes that this is the point to go out. He hasn't done a lot in recent years, and he was interviewed by BBC Radio 4, and what he said was, funny enough, I'd retired when I was sent the script, and I turned it down 3 times, but I kept falling in love with him every time I read it, and so I did it. Going on to say, I kept saying I'm going to retire. Well, I am now, because I figured I've had a picture where I played the lead, and it's got incredible reviews. The only parts I'm likely to get now are old men. 90-year-old men, well, maybe 85, and I thought, well, I might as well leave with all this. I've got wonderful reviews, and what am I going to do to beat this? What an incredible career. What an incredible human. Do yourself a favor and watch every Michael Caine movie you can. There was an old joke on a cartoon show I used to like in the 90s called The Critic, where a character was making like this giant action set piece with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Bruce Willis and Sylvester Stallone, and then he kind of offhandedly says, hey, and Michael Caine can't make a movie without Michael Caine. So there you go. Something that I kind of wanted to talk about a little bit that is a part of coverage we used to do a few years ago before we had video content at Mixdown. And this is a big part of what is now kind of the giant Walking Dead universe. So some of you might be a little too young, but then a lot of you probably aren't, where just a few years ago, The Walking Dead and zombie-related fare were basically the most popular thing running in pop culture and entertainment. The Walking Dead was a wildfire success show, and even though it was on cable, which is different than broadcast terrestrial television, this is, of course, prior to the streaming era. This is kind of like the end of the terrestrial cable era. The Walking Dead was like the most popular show in basic, expanded cable history. And it got more and more and more popular. It was incredibly violent. Characters died all the time. And it was largely anchored on, Andrew Lincoln as the star of the show playing Rick Grimes. And the show kind of hit a spectacular nosedive where a character that was very famous from the comic books, played by Jeffrey Dean Morgan, a character called Negan, was introduced. And Negan is about as terrible as a villain could possibly be, a horrifying menace of a character, and then brutally murdered a couple of the show's, stars, the characters, some of the big famous characters. I know, spoiler alert, it's been like 6, 7, 8 years by now. Hopefully you know what this is I'm talking about. But without going too far into the spoilers there, that particular act was so brutal, a large part of the show's audience kind of just immediately disappeared. People just couldn't hack it for whatever reason, even though Jeffrey Dean Morgan's performance was awesome and he's a phenomenal actor, and it's, wonderful to see him play such a malevolent character. It was just proved to be the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of people's tolerance for seeing things that they had become infatuated with get brutally murdered, be it zombie or human wielding a, razor barbed wire coated baseball bat. And ultimately, some of the cast of the show started to filter out. Various people started to leave the show and its spinoffs, but that kind of didn't stop AMC from pumping even more time and effort into more and more spinoffs. And so not long after that, Andrew Lincoln had announced that he was going to step away from the show. His character was going to leave the show. And the reasoning that was given very openly at San Diego Comic-Con at the time and in press reports was that he wanted to spend more time with his family, that he was having to spend half of the year, every year, shooting scenes and episodes for The Walking Dead. He was away from his children too much. He wanted to be with them much. And then right as they announced that he was leaving, they indicated that he was going to be part of a series of Rick Grimes spinoff Walking Dead movies. Now, for a while, these were going to be made as first-run movies in theaters, and then probably the pandemic kind of got in the way of that. And what ended up happening is that this has mutated into a series. And so instead of it being 3 made for the theaters movies, now it's become a limited series, and it's called The Walking Dead: The Ones Who Live. And it's supposed to explain the story of what happened to his character, Rick Grimes, in the show, where he's been. And that's stapled also to Danai Gurira's story, which is her character Michonne, was his character's love interest and, basically his family in the show, how she had gone looking for him. And now they have just this week put out the first piece of footage of this after years of talking about this and building this up. And it's about 37 seconds long. Doesn't really say much, doesn't really show much, but it's interesting to note that this whole thing where maybe Andrew Lincoln should have never left the show and should have remained the star of the show should have just ended before it did. The show did end up ending. They finally did end the show last year. But in the meantime, since, there's been a series of spinoffs that have involved various characters from the show, and one of which is literally called Daryl Dixon, starring Norman Reedus playing the character of the same name. There is a Maggie and Negan paired show called The Walking Dead: Dead City. There was also 8 seasons. Yes, I'm not kidding. They got to 8 seasons of Fear the Walking Dead. And then there were also spinoffs called Tales of the Walking Dead and World Beyond. So this 37-second trailer, of course, features Denna Guerrera and Andrew Lincoln, but then it also is going to be a limited series that's going to feature Pollyanna McIntosh, who some people who watch the show might remember as playing the character Jadis. So interesting. If you're someone who's still holding on to that fandom, you might be very happy right now, but I wonder how many people are still kind of paying attention because the zeitgeist of culture has moved on a bit from zombies. Zombies were such a thing just a few years ago. In the world of television, some sad news that I don't know. When I grew up, this was the kind of thing. This was a personality that we just kind of grew up with. And it was in a different era because now everything's just streaming on demand. There's 8 million things in 8 million places. Back in the early days of, my life, the late 70s, early 80s, there was a handful of channels. By the 80s, maybe a couple dozen. And, there wasn't many shows that there were ever made. And the shows that were tended to be very popular since there wasn't a ton of options that were out there. And in that time, if you were alive in the early 80s, you were probably acutely aware of a show called Three's Company. And Three's Company starred John Ritter, Joyce DeWitt, and Suzanne Somers. Suzanne Somers has passed away this week. And it is that unfortunate news that after a long battle with breast cancer, some 20 years of fighting breast cancer, it ultimately recurred, and she succumbed earlier this week on October 16th. She was known for her time on that very successful show, that kind of oddball series of three people living in an apartment and their misadventures. Pretty, typical situation comedy stuff for its era, but very beloved nonetheless, and kind of a silly, fun, kind of vaguely sexy thing that was what it was at the time. And then after that, Suzanne Somers went on to a show that if you were, 8 to 10 years old in the late 80s, early 90s, you're probably aware of the ABC TJF lineup where shows like, Family Matters and, Perfect Strangers aired, and ultimately she was the star of one of the shows in that block, which was called Step by Step, which had her starring along Patrick Duffy, which was at the time kind of a radical concept of two divorced people marrying into each other and their families commingling, which is not entirely uncommon in this day and age, or even then, but it was an interesting thing. And then lastly, just a little interesting story something I kind of have a loose eye on. And it's something that I think if you're outside the realm of what is most common people, you probably haven't heard of this, which is in the arena of video games. Now, in video games, there's actually a big buyer, resale market for older consoles and older video games. Some people, just like music, kind of never grow out of a certain era of graphics and technology and interactivity. And what happens is this stuff becomes fodder for resale stores, just like the way people buy used vinyl and stuff like that. And there are still people buying Nintendo Entertainment System consoles. There's still people buying Sega Genesis consoles or N64 consoles. Well, there's a company called Analogue, and they have announced a new product that is probably going to sell out in a flat second called Analogue 3D. And Analogue 3D is going to be a hardware, not software, cartridge-based available system that what it does is that you can use it as a Nintendo 64. It can play Nintendo 64 cartridges. So they have figured out how to make something that can interadapt with the pin connectors of the original N64 cartridges. And they are claiming this will be a complete 4K support, and it will be complete open localization. So any platform, any territory that N64 games were released for, it will be able to, as long as the cartridge is in good shape, of course, actually be able to support and do it. This is a company that came on my radar some years ago because they put together a device called the Pocket. And the Pocket was like this super Game Boy. It was designed to play all the different form factors of any possible Game Boy that Nintendo ever made. And those games and those systems are still really popular. The Pocket has been sold out as long as I heard about it, and they have never put it back up for sale. So it's kind of a strange business model. I'd like to do some more reporting on this to try to find out why. And, if it's such a wildfire success, why don't they just keep making more? Maybe there's supply chain problems. I don't know. Now, to end off here today, I want to tell a story. And a part of the story is going to be a part of why we weren't on the air last week, which we definitely wanted to be on the air last week. So before coming to last week, the weekend prior, so not this weekend that just ended, the weekend prior, I went to the Power Trip Festival. As you might see here right in front of me, this unusual little diorama. The Power Trip Festival is kind of an ongoing series of experiments that the promoter Golden Voice, which is underneath Anschutz Entertainment Group, or AG, the same company that puts on Coachella, is doing in the same place that Coachella happens, which is the Empire Polo Fields. If you've never been to Coachella, you have to drive about 2 hours east into the desert, past Palm Springs, and there's a place called Indio, and then you go south down a road, and you're in these giant blocks that go on forever with big palm trees. There's this massive old polo field where I guess people used to play polo, and that's where Coachella happens. And of course, over the years, it's gotten bigger and bigger as the attendance of the festival has gotten bigger and bigger. Some years ago, they announced a series of satellite events that would happen. Sometimes they have a country music festival called Stagecoach that happens there, usually just about every year. And then some years back, they also did an event called Desert Trip, which was kind of like a throwback to like the legends of classic rock, your Bob Dylans, your Neil Youngs, your Rolling Stones. You know, basically it was meant to be the best acts of yesteryear. And instead of it being a full festival like Coachella, where there's 80 gabillion bands playing, it was just 6. So Power Trip Festival, as it was booked, was kind of like the greats of hard rock and metal. Some of the most legendary acts of hard rock and metal. It was announced to be Iron Maiden, Guns N' Roses, Ozzy Osbourne, AC/DC, Tool, and Metallica. Now, Ozzy Osbourne's had a lot of famously reported health problems. The poor guy's in rough shape and has taken himself out of all of his tours after trying very hard to get on the road for a while. And ultimately, he had to back out of playing, and he was replaced by Judas Priest. So 6 bands, 3 days, 2 bands per day, middle of the desert. Thankfully, blissfully, because it was 105 degrees every day after dusk. So what ended up happening is that Friday was slated to be Iron Maiden and, Guns N' Roses. Saturday was slated to be Judas Priest and AC/DC. And then Sunday was slated to be Tool and Metallica. Now, I've been kind of thinking on doing this for a while and ultimately decided I should. Was granted access to do this and to cover and to shoot it. And apparently only a handful of people were granted the rights to do it. So I'm very grateful for the PR team behind the festival for granting me the right to be able to shoot the shows. And the sets that are there we'll include in the description for this when we put this video up on YouTube, links to all the coverage and that happened. And so, I basically left my home to drive out there trying to beat the traffic, assuming it was just going to be bad traffic, like 10 a.m. Drove straight out there, fought the traffic, had to stay at a hotel that was about 15 minutes away, drove in about 4:30, thinking that'd be enough time, literally got stuck in traffic for over 2 hours. Was supposed to shoot Iron Maiden, was approved to shoot Iron Maiden, did not make it into the event in time to do it. Was, the first 3 songs is usually if you're shooting the show when you are able to do it. So I missed my chance to shoot that band. Still got to see Iron Maiden set. But the parking situation was a fiasco. And I'm being most likely because everyone was coming in late from Los Angeles. Everyone's probably trying to skip Iron Maiden, go to see Guns N' Roses, Guns N' Roses being such a big institution. And it was just a disaster. You couldn't go anywhere. Everywhere you were, traffic cops wouldn't letting you basically get in. And you couldn't turn around anywhere. There was nowhere to legally do U-turns. It was just a nightmare. And everywhere you looked, there wasn't anything even saying where parking was. So I got worked out and got in there. Still, at that point, even at dusk, incredibly hot, came through. And if you've ever been to or seen Coachella, usually Coachella on the main stage, there's usually 6-7 stages at Coachella, but it was just the one stage, just the main stage. The area that would be the main stage field was set up in tiers of assigned seating. So people were paying for tiers of assigned seating, and then there was a pit right in front of the stage you could pay even more for. It's like what you call in the old days an orchestra pit. And ultimately, this was, cavernous. I don't know how it felt like a bigger space than Coachella. I've been to Coachella a million times. It felt like just you were miles and miles away from the stage, even in the assigned seating area. People were paying really good money, upwards of $1,100 a ticket. Wow, so expensive. And to be fair, some of the biggest rock bands there ever has been, but wow. What an enormous expense. And then past the assigned seating, there was a section for bring your own chair seating, like lawn chair kind of thing. And then beyond that, there was no seating. Just stand or sit in the grass. Don't bring any chairs. And they had giant video walls set up what felt like miles from the stage so that people who weren't in assigned seating could see things clearly. Because you couldn't. Even from some of the seated areas, you couldn't. Stage was still really, really far away. So I got in, saw Iron Maiden. And they were very good. They were doing a mix of their most recent album and then a bevy of hits from their Somewhere in Time record, their classic Somewhere in Time record from the 80s, and then a handful of their greatest songs, But what I said in my coverage was the problem with seeing an Iron Maiden set is that unless they played for like 4 hours or they only played just the biggest hits, you're just never going to see every song that you want to see. Iron Maiden has so many great songs throughout their career. So a good show, but you still felt like, you're not hearing Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, you're not hearing Run to the Hills, you're not hearing some of those really classic, Iron Maiden cuts, Aces High, the list goes on and on. Any 2-hour set they picked, there's probably 2 hours more that you're not getting to hear that you wish you could. Then Guns N' Roses played. And this is one that is really, really tough for me to talk about because I was really looking forward to it. Grew up on Guns N' Roses. First cassettes I ever bought with my own money were Use Your Illusions 1 and 2 in 1991, the week they came out. Was a really big thing to me for a lot of years listening to those records. And I am just sad to say, I wish I could say something different. Axl's voice just isn't there anymore. Axl Rose is a wonderful singer, has always had an amazing, unique, distinct voice, has always been, the pace car for rock and roll showmanship. He's a great songwriter too, along with Slash and Duff and, previously Izzy Stradlin when Izzy was still in the band. Incredible band. All the players sound great. All the musicians sound great, even the newer people that are kind of like the hired guns that aren't the original members. But everywhere you went the rest of the weekend, anybody that talked to you, anyone that you saw when you're like, what did you think of that Guns N' Roses show? Nobody was happy with Axl Rose's voice. To his credit, it did not look like he was not trying. He was trying very hard, and he's still a great showman and a great, great performer. But it just sounds like what he has always had to do with his voice has just been too hard on his voice. He can't hit the notes the way you remember them on those songs. And they played a staggering 3-hour set after Iron Maiden had already played a couple of hours. So my biggest problem with the set was there was a lot of stuff that I think a lot of people could have done without. And the big ending of the set where they played songs like Coma and Sweet Child of Mine and November Rain and, Night Train, and then of course Paradise City being the logical endpoint, it felt rushed, right? They did a cover of Glenn Campbell's famous Wichita Lineman. It's a fantastic song, and Axl didn't do a terrible job singing it. But when there's all these other songs people would rather hear, why that? There were numerous covers throughout the set, some that were obvious, like Knocking on Heaven's Door or Live and Let Die, but then also UK subs. Okay, sure, probably something that Duff McKagan's a fan of. Cool, I get it. But at the same time, also tons of rarities, B-sides, and also the 2 more recent new songs that are the 2 first new songs they've done together as a band, since the 90s, since the Use Your Illusion days. And I mean, nobody knows that material. So what you had was a lot of kind of low moments in the midst of a set that probably went on too long. And God bless him, but Axl Rose just doesn't sound like the way you remember him. Now, I said it as much in my coverage. Axl Rose isn't the singer that he was. He's the singer that he is now. But it's really hard when the band and that voice is so distinct, when you're expecting to hear things a certain way, and it just doesn't come out that way. So, late night of coverage, writing, making sure everything's done. Oh, I should add and point out, I missed my chance to shoot Iron Maiden. Nobody gets to shoot Guns N' Roses. Apparently only one photographer was approved to shoot Guns N' Roses, and nobody else did, so no photos there. Would have happily if it was possible, but that's pretty known. Guns N' Roses doesn't really let people shoot their shows. That's just not a thing that they do. They haven't pretty much ever, as far as I understand. And then the next day, Saturday, was Judas Priest and AC/DC. And Judas Priest was really good. The band's been around 50 years now. Rob Halford, to his credit, has always kind of been exactly what he is and has held the flag high for what he is. All credit and respect due. A fun set. I wouldn't call it anything that was just genius or knocked my socks off, but there's nothing I could say bad about it. It was good to see. If anything, it was the kind of thing where it's just staggering to think Judas Priest has been a band for 50 years? Good Lord. How in the world have that much time passed? The band that did Breaking the Law and felt like such a dangerous thing in their days when they did Painkiller and, in the late 80s, they are not young anymore. There's no getting around it. AC/DC headlined on Saturday, and AC/DC kind of ran away with the whole festival. I mean, Guns N' Roses was a big helping of self-indulgence, right? Long guitar solos, other covers, things that maybe weren't what people needed. And then, of course, what happened Sunday is a different kind of indulgence that I'll talk to in a second. But AC/DC came with a vengeance. Brian Johnson had been out of the band, almost lost his hearing. Axl Rose actually stepped in 2016 prior to the pandemic and played a bunch of shows that AC/DC had to delay. And so no one was really entirely sure what this was going to look like. And it was the remaining members, of course. Malcolm Young is no longer there, but Cliff and Angus Young, and then, Brian Johnson on vocals. Ultimately, the set was fire in every way that it could be. I mean, for other bands on the weekend that were all about kind of challenging what they were thinking or what their set should be or what they wanted people to hear, AC/DC was just like songs. And they led with 6 or 7 of their best songs right out the gate. Right there in the photo pit with the other photographers getting ready to shoot. They opened with If You Want Blood, You Got It. And like 30 seconds into the show, the place just had that electricity in the air. And I'm not the world's biggest AC/DC fan. I've always liked AC/DC. Never, ever had a problem with AC/DC. Liked some of the records in my life, but I've never been a passionate fan. And you could just feel that electricity in the air. That no nonsense, we're coming right for your jugular approach to being a band. And here's a song, and here's another song, and here's another song you love, and here's another song you love. It's all about high spots. It's all about bringing you in. It's all about release and celebration. It's amazing. They did such a wonderful job. So proud to have seen them once again. Another band that's technically been around for 50 freaking years. The last day was Tool and Metallica. Now, I've always loved Tool. Tool's a great band. Maynard James Keenan and Adam Jones and Justin Chancellor and Danny Carey are 4 of the finest players that the last 30 years of rock have ever seen. Probably one of the best 4-piece combos along since Led Zeppelin, just to be 100% honest. Wonderful, wonderful band. But coming off of the all killer, no filler kind of approach that AC/DC had, Tool almost came off feeling a little indulgent. There was a period of about 4 songs in a row that were 15 minutes plus, including some of the tracks from Fear Inoculum, some songs like The Grudge or, Push It, going all the way back to Anima. And, aesthetically, sonically, brilliant, perfect, technically flawless, right? There's nothing to complain about. Like, as far as 4 players are concerned, it's immaculate. They are, of course, kind of the arch princes of prog metal, like they are the most popular face of art metal, whatever you want to call that. Heavily indulgent, elaborate, complicated, heavy rock and roll. And there's no way that you can't, as someone who's adjacent to music, listen and look at that and not be wowed and impressed by what they're capable of. But it was hard to follow AC/DC being so right to the point and all about trying to help the crowd love what they experienced. And ultimately, it was fun. It was a good show. I'm glad to have seen it. Once again, glad to have shot the show. And even if it was only one song, we were allowed to be in the photo pit for that show, for that set. When the songs came to a conclusion, when the set ended, they ended very, very strong, coming with Stinkfist, Swamp Song, the only song from Undertow played in the set. And then, of course, Anima, the song maybe tongue-in-cheek talking about all of Southern California being washed away in a tidal wave. Those last 3 songs were amazing. But it was such a long way to go before you had that kind of satisfaction. I think that's always kind of famously been the tug of war of the band. They're all such brilliantly talented players. They're all kind of pulling on what the band could and should be. And of course, Maynard James Keenan and his output, he's done a lot with A Perfect Circle and Pussifer in the years intervening. Right, but maybe that's something of a material that's a little bit more resonant to him. He gets his fix with some of the things he might prefer to do in those bands, and those bands are fantastic. I'm a big Pussifer fan myself. Lastly, Metallica played. Metallica is always good, and they're always pretty serious about taking care of their fans and, trying to put on a great show. And they had kind of their stadium built in the round thing where they could walk around into a decent part of the pit portion of the crowd. And, it was great. I've seen Metallica a ton of times, more times than I think I need to, honestly. And the end result of it really kind of still just paled in comparison to AC/DC. Metallica is wonderful. I give them all the credit in the world. They work very, very hard and they care very much about what they do. But somehow it still just lacked that magnetic energy that AC/DC did. So drove all the way back to to Los Angeles from Indio that night. Sped home, processed a ton of photos. I think I finished at 6:30 in the morning. The next day, felt pretty okay. I was tired, woke up at noon after being up till 6:30 in the morning, and, thought, okay, well, I'm back. That's over. There's so much to do. There's work to do. Moved on with my night and had a weird night. Basically kept getting woken up every 30 minutes. Didn't really feel weird. And then the next day it hit me. And things started to feel weird. Started to shiver as I got later in the evening. And then as the next day came, my wife suggested, hey, you should take a COVID test. And sure enough, unfortunate enough, the test came back positive. So the reason we weren't on the air last week was because I was too sick to do the show. And I've basically been recovering from COVID-19 ever since. So it's hard for me not to look at this moment and everything that was without kind of factoring that as an aftermath into what's happened. Now, I had my own problems with COVID-19 in 2020 when the pandemic happened, a whole smattering of serious health problems that I won't go into a ton of detail here, and it took me several years to recover from. COVID-19 is no joke. And so for me, it has been a tiptoeing back to music and live events, even movies and movie screenings, in the heels of that threat. And like many people, I am vaccinated, and, I think that's part of the reason why I'm in good repair, and I'm not just totally bedridden right now. And what I can tell, having now gone a second go-round with this lousy virus, is that everything that you've been told about it was no joke. I could feel it this time, basically just going through different parts of my system and damaging it. I can feel it messing things up. Now, from my understanding of science, the vaccine and the booster shots that have gotten previously will keep me alive, will ultimately stop the virus from going totally wacko unstoppably, but it doesn't shield you. It's not powerful enough in terms of how the virus keeps mutating to make it so that you're completely shielded from being able to even catch it. It's not enough to stop you from catching it. It's enough to keep you alive, which is a giant scientific victory, but it's not enough to stop you from getting it. This has been a miserable week, miserable 10 days. And I enjoy concerts and festivals. I have since I was 16 years old. It's a big part of why I started an entertainment magazine. Live music and live experiences are a wonderful thing to behold. But it has been abominable going through this. And not because I'm like a person who's like, oh no, I refuse to quarantine. I would rather die than get anybody sick. I don't think that my right to do things is more important than keeping other human beings safe. Freedom is great, but at what cost is really the question that I always have to ask myself. The idea of infecting anyone else with this and having to have them lose time, work, or money, or just the ability to feel comfortable and safe. It's abominable. And a thing that it has had me thinking, and like I mentioned at the top of this broadcast, I wager that not a lot of people are going to like to hear what I have to say right here. I knew the risks. I took the risks. I wore masks most of the time, even outside, even when it's supposed to be that being outside, COVID doesn't really spread that well, like most viruses don't, especially in a warm time. It's not really supposed to be easy to contract something like that in that kind of climate. And this particular festival, the third day, is still 94 degrees at 8:30 p.m. So you'd think outdoors, generally staying away from people, and generally wearing a mask, trying to whenever I was in any crowds of people, kind of like I did with Sick New World earlier this year. You'd think that it wouldn't be too much of a threat, but it happened. Where? I don't know. There was a couple times walking by someone, they sneezed. Maybe that was it. Who knows? Maybe it was the handful of people that I had a conversation with, just meeting someone somewhere in the crowd and not having a mask on. Who knows? But nothing that's followed has been all that fun. Now, the pandemic was awful, and quarantine and lockdown was awful. I don't think I'm a person who's like in favor of being quarantined and not being able to go anywhere, see anyone, do anything. Didn't see my family for 2+ years behind it. None of that is fun. None of that is good. I'm not advocating for what that was. But what is clear to me, as I've now lived through this a second time, is that the threat is still very real. And while I completely understand bands need to make a living, people in the music business need to make a living, businesses need to continue to find a way to make a living, there is absolutely a right to an ability to do these kinds of things. But I have to wonder if this belligerent rush to be back a part of the world that we knew, movies and concerts and sporting events, if it still might not be a bit premature. I know a lot of you out there are going to like hearing that. I know a lot of you out there just want to move on, just want to be able to go and do things, experience things, be together. But I'm a person of decent health. I take good care of myself. I'm careful about what I eat, careful about what I exercise. I'm not, an elderly patient or someone with, possible life-threatening, pre-existing conditions. And this is not as mild as people have made it out to be. It hasn't been fun. I'm going to be fine. I'm going to be okay. Going to survive all of this. But I can't imagine if you have a pre-existing condition. And what generally people are like, oh yeah, it's mild. You don't feel good for a couple of days and then it's fine. It's like having a cold in the old days. I feel like this situation is probably a good 7 years away from where it's really feasible without putting people in jeopardy. Now, I'm not blaming Golden Voice or Power Trip. I'm not blaming any of the wonderful people in the PR team who helped get me into this event. I have to take responsibility for my own choices. I knew the risks and I went anyways. I knew my susceptibility to this and I went anyways, hoping that it wouldn't be there. But I do have to say out loud, it does feel like all of us being in these big congregated spaces, both indoor and out, it might be premature. Now, eventually, we will evolve as a species, just like we did when the Spanish flu pandemic happened. And that eventually we will evolve to a point where this will kind of be like a cold or a flu. And, it won't necessarily be as bad as what it is. But right now it still is. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know how you can mitigate these kinds of things. And of course, because, you can hear reports left, right, and center that the situation is such that like there are booster shots available and people won't get them. There are things that could bring down the spread of infections and people aren't interested. And yet this threat is still very much here. And it is super easy to transmit it and it is super easy to spread it. I have to wonder, in the face of this, if there isn't a better way. I don't have any answers, but it has to be said that the risk is probably too great. I know most people are going to disagree with me. I know most people are going to be like, I'm going to a show. I mean, the feeling at anything that I have tiptoed up to has been one of like aggressive rage, celebrate, probably a reaction to everything in terms of being shut in and lockdowns and things like that. I have to admit, there's a somberness to seeing Power Trip, seeing even James Hetfield talk about being a 60-plus-year-old deaf man. That's James Hetfield, which was at one point one of the scariest voices in rock and roll. Rob Halford, 70 years old. Brian Johnson, 70 years old. None of these bands are getting any younger. Ask yourself what this looks like in 10 years. I get it. There's a desire and a need and interest and infatuation, and those fans have as much right to hear anything as anyone who's 21 years old. No doubt. But 100,000, maybe? Some of people, that's my eyeball guess, just having been to some very big festivals in my past. It's a rough situation. And so for me, the calculus is definitely going to change, at least for the next few years, looking at this situation and the threats and the risks that are there. And if you're uncertain, or if you have pre-existing health conditions, I would think twice. Just know the risks. It can happen. Maybe it won't. Maybe you go walk around willy-nilly without a mask on and say la-di-da. Maybe nothing happens to you. But I can say from personal experience, again, this is no joke and this is no fun. And it is a thing for any company like Golden Voice that's putting on an event of this magnitude. I'm sure they're well aware of it. I'm sure they're astutely aware of the risk and the threat to their consumers, to their fans. And of course, I'm not saying this from any point of like legal responsibility. They've very much in the terms of service of going to the event said, you recognize that COVID-19 is real and alive and well and a threat, and you could get it if you're in a place with people. So it's nothing like that, but I still have to wonder if now is the time, and if there isn't some other way to do this to mitigate that threat better. And maybe people wouldn't want to hear that. Maybe that means everybody would have to wear a mask or something, and no one has the aptitude or, not the aptitude, but the appetite, excuse me, that's the word I'm looking for that. But for me, this is definitely a bit of a game-changing kind of moment. Love music, always will. Can't say that this is my last concert, but it might be close, at least for a good long while. So that's it for episode 45 of This Week is Live. Want to thank you again for joining us or engaging with this content in any of the places that you do, whether it's here on Twitch when we broadcast this live on Thursdays from 5:30 till 6:30. I know we were late today because of technical problems. I apologize for that if you were sitting around waiting. Or when we post these after the fact, the following week on Tuesdays or Wednesdays on YouTube. We also share clips from this on social media, be it Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Reels, YouTube Shorts, any of the places that you do engage with this content. We thank you tremendously. And we will be here each week, as I have mentioned in the previous broadcasts. And of course, this is assuming that my health continues to recover and everything's okay and COVID becomes a thing in the very far rearview mirror for me. The plan right now is we're going to go to episode 50 and then we're going to call it kind of a season. I don't know if there's exactly a season type show, but then we're going to take a little break and we're going to be back in 2024 and next year, but we're going to keep going. So that means we've got 5 episodes left. This Week is Live for 2023. So please join us again next week live. We'll be back here and we'll have lots more stuff, lots more headlines, more interviews, more surprises, and other kinds of great video content that Mixdown is up to. We thank you again for joining us. Please come back next week, 5:30 p.m. Pacific time on Twitch. Thanks again. So glad to see you well.